Hey everyone, welcome to another video. Remember, if you love film, gaming, or television content, please consider clicking that subscribe button because I thought I'd wind back the clock a little bit and revisit Tenet, a film that I had very mixed feelings on when I first watched it. Well, I have finally rewatched it in the lead up to Oppenheimer, and I want to talk to you about it, so let's get into it. So I think it's important to tell you my experience with this film when I first watched it. I was really excited for this movie. I saw a really cool cinema viewing of Inception in the lead up to Tenet just because I was so excited to see another Christopher Nolan film. It was one of my most anticipated films of that year, and I really thought that this was going to be the next big ambitious film from Christopher Nolan. He dedicates so much time to creating such a practical and unique experience in the theater. And another thing that I really like about his style of filmmaking is he can take a lot of concepts that are really hard for really anyone to understand, and he simplifies it, makes it easy to digest, and I really love that approach to his filmmaking. So naturally, I was excited to see Tenet. His approach on full scale, moving forwards and backwards in time. It was unlike anything that we had really ever seen from him. He's played with that concept before in a film like INTERSTELLAR, which I think he did a fantastic job of. So I was really excited to see him dive a little bit more into those concepts. Unfortunately for me, when I first came out of seeing that film, I was quite disappointed. Tenet is one of the most disappointing films I've ever seen. Not that it's terrible by any means. I think it's a solid enough movie, but it was nowhere near hitting towards what I had expected this film to deliver on. This is by far Christopher Nolan's most complex film. It almost was one of those ones where it really encouraged a rewatch just because there were so many concepts. And the way that the film ends, it kind of reframes everything that came before it. So a rewatch would be beneficial to know about everything that is going to happen in the story. However, I was held back from understanding a lot of the film's concepts because unfortunately the sound mixing was garbage. I still to this day think that Tenet has maybe the worst sound mixing I have ever heard. I could not hear about 50% of the dialogue spoken, and that really is an exaggeration. I was getting really frustrated towards the end of my screening, and it's not like I was in a bad theater either. It was a pretty new theater, great speakers, great screen. It was unfortunately the sound mixing. And I always promised myself, look, we'll rewatch this, we'll buy the Blu-ray or watch it on streaming, we'll chuck on subtitles, we can understand the entire concepts that Christopher Nolan is going for here, and maybe then I'll enjoy the film a lot more than what I did on that first watch. And I just never did. I just thought that it would be too exhausting of a rewatch, and I just didn't know if I had what it took to really sit there, fully pay attention to what Christopher Nolan was delivering here. But most recently I did. Once again, I kind of did it with a strange double feature of Christopher Nolan movies. The first time I watched Inception, then about a week later I watched Tenet. This time I watched Interstellar, my favorite Christopher Nolan film, and then straight after I watched Tenet. And watching them both together just really illustrated how much Tenet is still lacking in my eyes, despite how much more I got from the story. I think the beauty of watching these is that they both tackle some really dense subject matter, some concepts that we just cannot wrap our head around. Interstellar with space, time, gravity, all of these things that the most genius scientists can only theorize about, but we can never know the answer because how can we ever go into a black hole? Christopher Nolan plays with that in a really interesting way. He uses real-world math in a lot of the science presented in this film. And to me, it is my favorite sci-fi film of all time. But it's not just that makes it special. It's the fact that he's able to combine that with a real heartfelt backbone to the story. Matthew McConaughey's character is attached to his family. Every other character in this has some personal stakes that just make the journey all the more interesting and invest you in the story. And unfortunately, Tenet doesn't really bring that to the table. It has all the flashiness, all of the high-end concepts that are so interesting to play around with, but none of the heart. It tries to, at points, Elizabeth Debicki's character tries to bring the heartfelt backbone to it, but it kind of happens too late, and it's not really directly impacting the characters enough where I could really consider it to be on the level of Interstellar or Inception. Inception plays with that too. It plays with dreams and all these different concepts, but it also has that heartfelt back end with Cobb and his wife and what happened in his past. It's all interesting stuff, and it makes you care about the characters. Tenet doesn't do that. Tenet is afraid to even name its protagonist. He just calls him the protagonist. And even though John David Washington plays him really well, I think he's a fantastic actor. Robert Pattinson plays an excellent role in this. You still can't really connect with him, and it always feels like you're at arm's reach with the character, and it's kind of frustrating, even on a second watch, knowing a lot of what happened in this film. And I still think watching it play out with subtitles on, learning everything that I could, I still felt like I couldn't grasp everything. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I suddenly had a light bulb moment and I knew everything after the film. I had a long talk with my fiance about the film. I watched a couple of videos just theorizing about it, and while things started to click with me a little bit more as I was digesting the film a lot more and spending a lot more time with it in my head, which is quite beautiful about Tenet. I think that's the unique thing that it brings to the table. Watching the experience was a lot less fun than kind of figuring out what had happened, an hour or so after. I could rewatch this again, knowing almost everything that I know now, and I still think it would be a frustrating watch because the way that it presents its story is so convoluted, but it just doesn't need to be. If you take out all of the inversion and time stuff, you have a pretty generic spy movie, and I almost question at points what it brings to the table until we get to the very end of the movie, and it kind of makes sense of why that concept is there. Otherwise, though, it just seems like something that kind of adds to a lot of the flash that the film wants to present, but it has no substance. Now, I remember being a little bit exhausted after watching Interstellar, but I could still appreciate it because there was still so much there and I really wanted to learn more. And I just really think Tenet fails at that. And I know it's probably unfair to compare it to Interstellar, but in a lot of respects, I feel like they're trying to do the same thing. They're his most complex movies by far. They make you think about them the most out of everything that I've seen from him. But as I said, Tenet just feels so convoluted with the way it's presenting it. Interstellar feels kind of simple in terms of how it moves the film forward. It's not until we get to the third act that we start getting into some really crazy moments where you're just really theorizing about things. And it kind of opens it up for interpretation. Tenet just babbles a lot of nonsense at you for an hour, and I don't think it really makes any impression on you because you still haven't built that connection with any of the characters, and I think that's a real shame. I say that because I like a lot of things about this movie. I know it sounds like I'm really just downing on it right now, but as I said, I love the performances. I do like the characters in some respects. They're not my favorite Nolan characters by any means, but they're better than most characters out there. I also really like the way that it handles the more big action set pieces. They're so practical. They're beautiful to look at. Absolutely stunning. Better than most movies out there to this day. What Christopher Nolan can do is just excellent, and I would never want him to stop doing that. Even in this, I do think that Tenet is his weakest film, but it's still a hell of a lot better than a lot of other movies out there, so I give a ton of credit to him there. I also noticed that on this screening, on my TV, it didn't really bother me, the sound mixing too much, and that may be because I had subtitles, but I just tried to experiment a little bit and just tried to watch it without looking down at the subtitles every 2 seconds. And I did notice that I could distinguish what they were saying a lot more. Maybe it's just the big cinema speakers that really affected it with the sound of the score, background noise, going with this dialogue that at times is a little bit fast paced and they're talking about concepts that are really difficult to understand at first. And I think getting that first impression in such an overwhelming way with a massive screen and massive speakers it actually hurts this film. It's really weird to say because Christopher Nolan makes such epic movies that are made for the big screen. But Tenet, weirdly enough, tries so hard to be really excellent on the big screen that it fails and kind of loops back the other way. I feel like the best way to watch Tenet is at home. You could have a good speaker system and everything like that and watch it in 4K or whatever. But I would rather sit there on a smaller screen on my TV and hear what these people are saying rather than going to a theater paying a ton of money to not really understand half of what they're saying because the speakers are just blaring a lot of this background sound that's drowning out the dialogue. I'm going to go into some full spoilers here, so just be warned because there are topics that happen at the end that I really want to talk about too, because I think in some ways it saves the movie in a lot of ways and makes this maybe his most clever film. I think that the way this ends when you realize that Neil, who's played by Robert Pattinson, is Max, Elizabeth Debicki's kid, who appears throughout the film, is really interesting and it makes your head spin a little bit. I really like that the friendship that John David Washington has with Robert Pattinson in this film is almost going through that inversion process in of itself. Robert Pattinson has known John David Washington for a very long time. They've been friends for years. Well, John David Washington doesn't know Robert Pattinson at all and is really just meeting him for the first time. It's because Robert Pattinson has lived out all of John David Washington's future, which he hasn't moved forward yet. And this is where this gets really head spinning because everyone's moving in different directions. It gets real confusing real fast. Even the fight scenes, which I do think look phenomenal, but when someone's moving forward and one person's moving backwards, it's just so hard to wrap your head around what's really going on here. And it takes a few minutes before you realize who's moving forward, who's moving backwards. It's just so much at once. And I do credit the film for trying to be ambitious and complex. I do really like that aspect to it. And as I said, when you find out these details that it presents to you at the end of the film, I think it makes for a lot more of a richer experience. It justifies the whole time aspect because, as I said, it was just there to make some kind of unique action set pieces. But in terms of the narrative, I just didn't really see the point of having it there at all, to be honest with you. Do I want it there? Absolutely. I do think it looks cool. It looks impressive. It's interesting. It's unique. But you also have to justify that within the story. And as I said, I don't think Tenet does that until the very end and we get that explanation from Robert Pattinson's character. Overall, I do think that Tenet has a lot of quality to it. Hell, I would probably even consider watching it a third time. I really don't think it's like terrible or anything, but there were just all of these issues that I think made it a really disappointing experience, but I also think it's one of the most interesting movies I've ever seen. You never see such complex narratives played out on such a massive scale like this. It really almost never happens. Not with a budget, not like a Christopher Nolan budget where it's plus $100 million. You might see a Beau is Afraid where it's $30 to $50 million, but this is like next level. This is with the big boys here. And to present something like this that really makes you think, I really like that. And I do want to see more of. I just wish Tenet was packaged in a little bit more of a better way where you can still digest everything. It still has that complexity to it. But it makes you care about figuring out the answer. Because I think that for a lot of people, and this affected me for a while too, that Tenet becomes so frustrating that you just don't care about the answer by the end of it because your brain just hurts by the end of it. You're constantly thinking. You're always confused. Even on this second watch, I was just still real confused and just couldn't wrap my head around this whole time concept. I mean, some people, it just clicks and I respect the hell out of you for that. But for me, where all of these story beats and characters and everything's moving backwards and forwards and it's just all over the place, it becomes real convoluted real fast, and the movie just I still don't think does an excellent job at communicating that to you. This video is aimed to be a whole lot of context for you when I go into my Oppenheimer review, because I will mention that I think Tenet was pretty disappointing. And real hot take here, I feel like I'm the only person who's going to say this, I don't really like Dunkirk. I think both of these films are some of Nolan's weakest, in my opinion. So in some ways, I am a little bit nervous about Oppenheimer. I am, of course, excited. It looks really impressive from the trailers, but to me, so did Tenet. As I said, Tenet was one of my most anticipated films of the year. It was up there with Dune Part 1 and The French Dispatch, because I think they were all coming out at the same year, but the pandemic delayed those two. But those are just my quick thoughts towards Tenet, and I guess my first Christopher Nolan review on this channel. I am a massive fan of his work. As I said, I love Interstellar. I think that is the greatest sci-fi film of all time. I think Inception is right up there too. Obviously, the Dark Knight trilogy is fantastic. I still have got to see The Prestige and things like that. But it's definitely on my radar. It's Christopher Nolan. He makes fantastic films. And I'm really excited to see what he does in Oppenheimer. I'm actually glad he is going for a more straightforward story. I don't think Oppenheimer is going to be too complex. But I hope that the next time that Nolan wants to go for a massive concept that really warps your mind and your way of thinking, I think he needs to tie it back with a lot of emotional stakes like he did with Interstellar and Inception, because that way it just hits home so much harder and it makes every action that the character makes feel like it means something. As I said with Tenet, it just doesn't do that. It wants to be flashy and do all these interesting things, but it just does not have that substance behind it to make me want to care about what's happening to these characters and figuring out all the concepts that Nolan has on display here. Flashy action set pieces, some great fight choreography, and this interesting concept just aren't enough to really get me fully on board for this movie. I think if I had to give Tenet a score, it's like a 3 out of 5 to me. As I said, not terrible by any means, but not up there in that top echelon with the peak of Nolan. I think that it presents a lot of interesting ideas. As I said, great technical moments, great cinematography, fantastic score, but it just lacks something. And on the second watch, it was just as frustrating as the first, even with the sound problem fixed, because it just wants to do too much and doesn't really want to present it to you in a way that I felt was really satisfying. It felt clunky and at times felt tedious at its worst. But at its best, as I said, when we get to the ending, it really clicks a lot more and becomes a lot better of a film, and I just wanted a little bit more of that. Anyway, I am rambling. Those are just my quick thoughts towards Tenet. Are you excited for Oppenheimer? I'm sure you are. Everyone's talking about Barbie and Oppenheimer. I would say I'm probably more excited for Oppenheimer than Barbie, just because I'm a massive Nolan fan. I've been a fan of him for years, and while I like Greta Gerwig, she has not reached that level yet. She just hasn't made the number of films that Nolan has that are just in my top 30 or top 20 films of all time. He is that good, and I really think Oppenheimer will be one of my favorite films of the year because it looks so promising. Anyway, let me know in the comments below what you think of Tenet. Do you even care about this movie? I really don't know anymore. From my angle, it seems like a lot of people kind of have just left this one by the wayside. People love Dunkirk, Inception, Interstellar, Dark Knight Trilogy, Prestige, Memento, all of those films, but it seems like Tenet just doesn't get talked about as much, and I do understand why. I think a lot of people were like, I'm gonna rewatch this after seeing it at the theater, and just never did like I have. I just one day felt the need to really go back, and I did, and yeah, it's still just as frustrating, even though I picked up some more rewarding moments. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.